You're listening to the Hello World Podcast, number 42. My name is Sean Wildermuth, and I'm your host. The Hello World Podcast is where you can hear from some of your favorite speakers, developers, and authors about how they got started in this business and the decisions they made along the way. We go way back to their first computer, their first code experience, and their first job. On this week's show, I have Kate Gregory of C++ fame. Kate Gregory has been using C++ since before Microsoft had a C++ compiler and has been paid to program since 1979. She loves C++ and believes that software should make our lives easier. That includes making the lives of developers easier. She'll stay up late arguing about deterministic destruction or how C++ 11 is not the C++ you remember. Kate runs a small consulting firm in rural Ontario and provides mentoring and management consulting services, as well as writing code every week. She has spoken all over the world, written over a dozen books, and helped thousands of developers to be better at what they do. Kate is a Microsoft Regional Director, a C++ MVP, an Imagine Cup judge and mentor, and an active contributor to StackOverflow and other StackExchange sites. She develops courses for Pluralsight, primarily on C++ and Visual Studio. In 2014, she was the Open Content Chair for CppCon, the largest C++ conference ever held, where she also delivered sessions. It was great to finally catch up with Kate and talk about how she got started. It goes further back than I possibly could have expected. She even talks about the days where she was actively programming using punch cards. We do delve into C++ and C++ 11 and why that is so important, as well as some of the other languages she has learned to love over the years. Let's take a listen. So I've been really excited about our next guest. We've had some scheduling waits in order to get her on the show, but today I have with me Kate Gregory. How are you doing?
I'm fantastic. I'm enjoying an absolutely beautiful day.
Where are you about? I know you're on the East Coast someplace.
I'm in rural Ontario, about an hour and a half outside of Toronto.
Oh, okay.
And first you find nowhere, then you go directly to the middle of it. Yeah, that's where I am.
That's funny. And is it cold? You know, you're Canada after all.
Right now, it's the same temperature outside as in. I've actually been doing various things outside. I've had tradespeople here doing things, and you just go outside in whatever you're wearing, and it's not hot and It's not cold. It's just perfect right now. Yeah.
It's freezing here in Prague, so I thought it would have to be, ice conditions in Canada. Of course.
We have lovely, lovely falls. The leaves are changing. It's delightful. I like September a lot. The bugs are all dead because we have had one frost.
And that'll do it.
That's great. And now you're bug free
until spring.
Well, yeah, but I wish I could take software outside, and expose it to below zero temperatures, and then have no bugs in it. That'd be great.
There has to be a way. There has to be a way to make that work. So, as you probably know, the nature of the show is we want to know kind of how you got started. So did you have a computer growing up, or is this something that you got excited about in college, or where did that start, that interest in programming?
Yeah. I'm too old to have had a computer growing up. I actually tried to figure this out, and I'm pretty sure that it was in 1975, the first time I touched something that was called a computer by the person who was showing it to me. Looking back, it was probably a very, very large calculator, but the box was like the size of a television.
Wow.
And you entered expressions of some kind. And I was in like the math club because I was that kind of kid, chess club, math club.
Yeah, most of us.
And so we got this, special treat of getting to interact with this computer. And I put in some expression, and I guess it was a mathematical overflow because it said tilt. like a pinball machine. And I was like deeply offended. And I was like, computers are stupid. Because 100% of all the computers I'd had anything to do with were stupid. And so I wasn't going to have anything to do with computers at all.
Well,
that was clear and obvious to me.
Little did you know how actually true that was, how computers are actually stupid.
They really are. Actually, that may have been a good foundation.
And so where did that go?
So I was very good at math. I was also very good at science, but the science in high school is really boring. So the only science that I was getting a lot of exposure to I thought was boring. So I toddled off to take math at the University of Waterloo. And I can't say I really looked into it a lot. I was really young. I started school in England, and when I came to Canada, I was 8 years old and got placed into grade 5.
Wow.
Because they asked me questions at the back of the grade 5 textbook, and I could answer them all. So they said, okay, we'll put her in grade 5. And then just in case that wasn't advanced enough, I then whizzed through 5 years of Canadian high school in 4 years because I found it boring otherwise. So I showed up first year, I was 16 years old.
Wow.
And we lived halfway between Waterloo and Guelph, and my parents are like, you're living at home, so you can go to the University of Waterloo or the University of Guelph, take your pick.
Especially at 16.
So... yeah, exactly. So you don't have to do a lot of research to know that Guelph's strengths are things like agriculture and consumer studies. And they had a great also hotel administration program. And Waterloo had math and engineering and science and all that hard tech stuff. So, I chose Waterloo. Yes. So then I get there and I discover that the Faculty of Mathematics is really mostly about computer science.
Ah. And so your early hatred of computers is now starting to rear its ugly head.
Well, that's right. And you don't have any choice. It's like everyone had to take what we called Fortran, but what was officially called something like algorithms and data structures in What 5S. It was, one of these enormous classes with like 1,000 people in a lecture theater. But it is where I heard my very first programmer joke.
And do you remember it?
I do. It goes like this. It's better if you have visuals, but I'll tell you about the visual part. So why did the programmer drown in the shower?
I don't know. Why did he?
Well, you have to now. The visual is hold something up like you're reading it and say lather, rinse, repeat.
That's funny.
Yeah, it's one of the few things I remember from that class. So I had to take it whether I liked it or not. And so I learned What 5S and slowly but surely began to feel a little bit warmer towards computers. But at the same time, it turned out I didn't want a math degree after all. And I transferred over into chemical engineering. And that's the chemistry excited me, but the engineering was practical. You could go do something with it. You weren't just memorizing what a compound looked like.
Sure.
And when I got there, I discovered that I knew more programming than everybody else, and that was generally enough to get me, certainly to get me jobs that my classmates couldn't get, and also if you were doing group assignments, they'd be someone needs to write a program for part of this, and that'd be the part that I would do.
And did you find you had a natural aptitude to it? I mean, obviously you're bright, yes, but that doesn't always translate to developer acumen.
No, it doesn't. I don't really know how I got from, I really hate this. These things are stupid. To What 5S was a variant of Fortran. It was structured. So, we had if loops and whiles and that kind of thing. We had that business that you may have heard about with Fortran where variables got their type according to the first letter of their name. Uh-huh. So Hungarian, the original Hungarian notation. And I think I found it, logical and useful. The other thing is that Fortran was very much a scientifically oriented language. Mm-hmm. It wasn't about string manipulation or anything like that. It was about numbers, multiplying matrices or whatnot. And those were things that the scientific part of me thought were sensible and useful things to want to do. So it's good that the computer would help us kind of thing.
And it was a very practical way to solve the chemical problems.
Exactly. And so that's, I saw the opportunity to be able to get good at that. And both my math work and my engineering work were co-op, which Waterloo kind of pioneered in North America. Nice. So you'd have 4 months of school and then a 4-month work term. And I had a work term with no programming in it at all, purely a chemically oriented. It was testing glue. like gluing things together and seeing how much strength it took to rip them apart and that kind of stuff. And that was really horrible. That was a really, really horrible job. And
but the way you describe it sounds exciting.
Oh yeah. There was also the part where you put a blob of glue in hot water and put a billiard ball on it or a metal bowling ball and waited for the ball to fall through the block of glue. That was very exciting. It would take like half an hour and you had to have the measurement to the second.
Wow. Yeah. So you had to be there.
You had to be there. You couldn't I'll go get some coffee now or whatever. You had to be right there staring at it in case it dropped. And then you could record that it took, 32 minutes and 14 seconds. That was important.
Wow.
So, the opportunity to get a job where you wrote code instead of, gluing things that appealed for sure.
That's funny.
And so I had this little bit of Fortran and this little bit of confidence, and that was really all it took. So then I got a series of co-op jobs that were engineering jobs where I was using my engineering abilities, but I was writing code. I came in the morning and wrote code all day and went home having written a whole bunch of code. So I did modeling. I wrote something to model the way that scale grows on the inside of steam pipes, for example. And the people that I was working for were they had PhDs in this stuff and they had formulas and they'd be like, we've read 10 papers and we're pretty sure these are all the numbers for that should plug into this equation. So you run several, 100 cycles of this equation and tell me what you get for the thickness of the layers. And I would run it and they'd say, damn, that doesn't match reality at all. And they'd go off and tweak the equation to take more factors into account or whatever. And eventually they came up with a really good simulation that they were super happy with. So
because they could do the trial and error very quickly versus.
Yes. Yeah. So they used to do it by hand. I mean, there wasn't even spreadsheets. They used to do it with a calculator and a pen.
Wow. And
it would take months. So, and there was real money on the line. This scale that builds up in the pipes in a generating station, if it spalls off, it hits the turbine and wrecks it, which is a very, very large amount of money.
Millions of dollars, yeah.
Millions of dollars. And if you take the pipes down to scrub them out or replace them with fresh pipe too often, that's also a lot of money. So understanding the way the scale grows and when it's likely to be a risk of spalling was actually a super important problem. And so that was fun. I was writing code, but I was solving a real problem in the world. I liked that. I think that's when I got hooked.
Where you could actually see, that it was resulting in something real, not just monetary, but also, you were affecting the way things were happening. That's always exciting. And was that still Fortran or Fortran derived?
That was all. That was Fortran. I believe I had to take JCL cards to the card reader for that. The university had the famous Red Room and it had terminals that you could type your code in and do it all like that. But the place where I was working was a little bit further behind. So you typed your stuff into a file, but when you were ready to do it and you wanted to submit it, you had to physically go to a room and put 3 or 4 cards of JCL in the machine that said, go to this file and read it and run it.
Wow.
And so each of us had our own little magic invocation cards that you couldn't lose because then you couldn't submit jobs.
Wow. And how long did you do? And that was a job, one of the co-op jobs in college, right?
That's right. So that was a 4-month work term. And then I came back to the same company, but a different group. And I started working on some atmospheric models. So I was modeling the way pollutants move in the atmosphere. Taking weather data and using that to try to simulate not just them moving, but they reacting as they move. And the way they react depends on how high up they are and how much sunlight and whatnot they're exposed to.
Wow.
So that was super complicated and difficult and politically charged because the question of the day was whether the acid rain that was just devastating Ontario at that time was caused by emissions in Ontario from mines like the Sudbury nickel mines, or emissions in Tennessee from burning coal for electrical power.
Right.
And as you can imagine, that's a big deal question.
It is, especially with a border between them.
Exactly. And I'm just running my simulations, and that's what I really thought I was going to do for a living for the rest of my life, that I would model and simulate the world using my twin skills of chemical engineering ability and coding.
And what happened?
Well, a lot. Mostly that I discovered there was other things you could write code for. There's also not a ton of super lucrative jobs doing that.
Right.
So I enjoyed having a couple more work terms there with this research institute, but I thought I really got to explore the world. That to me is part of what co-op is about.
Right.
That you work in a bunch of different places so that you discover whether you like big companies or small companies or whatnot. So I got hired by an oil company, and I wrote pure code in the head office, like keeping track of how many sick days people had that year, that kind of thing, which was, like almost as much fun as watching the glue melt, really.
You're going from, simulating atmospheric models and chemical reactions to, is this a sick day or is this a personal day? Yeah.
Yeah. And using fourth generation languages, to write reports that's sorted by how many days they'd been off or whatever. Yeah. So that was not super great, but it helped me to understand some more of what could happen. And then I did have one particular project that I did for a guy in HR. And I was so young. Remember, I started when I was 16, so I was still pretty young when I graduated. I did not understand that when the guy from HR, who you've been working side by side with for months and really making his life better and easier, says to you, if you could have your dream job, what would it be? That he's not just chatting.
And what was that dream job you told him?
I said I would like to do like real engineering. You're an oil company, you build refineries. I'd like to do whatever it is that chemical engineers do here around you being an oil company, and still, be doing something with code and computers all the time. And they had a position in a group of engineers, which was called the computer contact, which was the person who handled all the computing. And it had been a full-time job. And this guy went to the person who was running it and said, she can do it in half the time. She's really good. So if you promise to let her do the proper engineering work the rest of the time, I think you can have her.
Wow.
And that worked out.
And was that when you left college, or was that another one of the co-op?
No. That was my first job when I graduated. So 1984, I'm a brand new graduate, and what a time to be a brand new graduate. They had, I think, 2 PCs when I started. They were in the computer room, and I was responsible for them. And these are engineers with degrees in engineering, okay? They can design pumps and distillation towers and things like that. They could not format floppy disks.
You have no idea how true I'm sure that is.
So at first, I would format a box of disks when I had a slow moment and then leave them in the computer room, and anyone who wanted them could have them. But word got out, and the entire building, we were in a 12-story building, on the 3rd floor, there's already formatted disks always in a box. You could just go down and get one. And so they kept disappearing. And that was cutting into my life too much of what I had to do. So I started keeping them in my room, which worked out really well because then people had to come and see me for a formatted disk, and I could find out what people were doing. And I taught people Lotus 1-2-3 and changed an awful lot of people's lives because they stopped doing things with pen and paper once they discovered that they could do things in 1-2-3. And I saw managers buying computers out of their chair budget.
Wow.
They had $1,000 or $2,000 or whatever that they could have replaced all the chairs on the floor with, and they would go out and buy PCs instead. It was insane. There was no such thing as computer budgets, but the managers could see the benefit. And
the huge benefit,
I really watched
really.
that whole. Yeah, it was just a revolution. Some of it was not as good as other parts. So say you wanted to design a heat exchanger. We had programs that came from head office that you could run that would take a bunch of inputs and give you an answer. So typically you design, and you say, here are my inputs, here's my design, run it all, and it would say your outputs are that it's going to get this much hotter or this much cooler.
Right.
And then you'd say, oh, rats, that I need something bigger or smaller, and you'd change all the numbers and you'd run it again. And at one point, we got a second mainframe so that we cut people's batch time in half, because these were all batch jobs. You submitted it, and then you got a notification when it was done. So we'd go from an hour per iteration to a half hour per iteration. And what happened was people stopped doing engineering. I mean, they would pick their parameters, submit it, get a number, and say, oh, I'll try changing this to 100. They wouldn't even think. They wouldn't go do any calculations. They'd just try changing it to 100. And then say, let's see if that makes it big enough. Oh, I made it smaller. I didn't even think. What an idiot. Then they'd submit another one, trying 50 or something.
Well, that sounds like development today. Yeah.
Yeah. So once the computer got quicker, the people started to just throw runs at it instead of stopping and calculating and thinking about things. But nonetheless, the amount of time and effort that was saved and projects that were able to be built, because there was sometimes a small window of time in which you could take advantage of something. And if it took you 2 years to design the equipment, the window of time would close and you wouldn't be able to take advantage of that. So it was a big change, big change. Yeah. And by the time that I left there, they were really moving away from one program for heat exchangers and one program for distillation towers and one program for this, to these great big suites that could simulate entire refineries or entire chemical plants. Wow. And I actually ended up doing some consulting work for a company that made one of those programs, and being able to work on some simulations of things that I would have thought would have been unsimulatable, but with the passage of time, it was possible. With Moore's law in effect and all that. Absolutely. Yes. So, had you moved into C++ at that point, or C or C++, I should say? So while I was at the big oil company, I mostly worked in PL1. Mm-hmm. And I had, by this time, a PC of our own, and we were doing a BASIC on that. Mm-hmm. I don't think it was a Microsoft product, but we were exploring other languages, and we had the Microsoft C compiler. And I had a friend who was behind me a little bit in school. He was much younger than me, and he was going to Microsoft. And he said, if you keep buying C compilers, you might find one day that you have a C++ compiler. And he was correct. That's exactly what happened. So I had actually started doing C++ before Microsoft had one, and that's what I often say in my intros, that I've been using C++ since before Microsoft had a C++ compiler. Wow. But I was quite happy to switch to theirs. And it was, I think, the third or fourth product that I owned by Microsoft. And I remember sitting in the office of our consulting company and saying, most of the software that we own, it's the only thing we own from that company. So, we had DBase, which was the only thing we had from, I think it was Ashton Tate in those days. It was. And we had something called Farlap that made your computer faster, and it was the only thing we had from those people. And we had a Smalltalk compiler, and we had a Windows, what you see is what you get kind of library called Vermont Views that generated C++ code. But we had, from Microsoft, we had Word, we had their MASM, the assembler, and we had the C compiler, which became the C++ compiler. And of course, we had DOS and I think Excel. And we're like, we've got 3 to 5 things from these people. I think they're going places. And the idea of buying stock never occurred to you at that point, probably. No, alas, no.
That's funny. So in these early days, were you primarily the programmer on a project?
Absolutely. I mean, at the oil company, I was the only person literally who could format disks, who could show them how to launch Lotus 123, who knew really anything about anything involving keyboards.
Show them where the slash key was so that Lotus would work.
Oh, Absolutely. Yes. And so I remember being really down on mice when they first came, because I'm like, if I want to move over 3 in the Lotus menu, I'll just hit the arrow key 3 times, like, why would I want a mouse? It took a while to realize that they had other purpose. But when I left the oil company to go back to graduate school, I wanted to supplement my income because graduate students don't really make any money. So we said, we'll make a consulting firm and we'll help people buy computers.
Oh, nice.
Because it's hard.
Yeah.
And that's what they'll pay us to do. But in fact, the very first person who wanted our help wanted us to write code. And we're like, oh, sure, we can do that. Yeah. It was, I think, BASIC or something. And so my husband and I, he was working full time and I was being a grad student, but we would each put in 10 hours on Saturday and 10 hours on Sunday.
Wow.
And that produced 40 hours a week of programming for this guy. And that our consulting company kind of was born from that, and it's stuck on from then on.
Really? Wow. So you've been running the same consulting company, since then?
Since then.
Wow.
So we started it, I would say, in 1986, just before I went back to grad school. And in Canada, you can start a company as a sole proprietorship, or if there's 2 of you, as a partnership without incorporating.
Oh, okay.
And that once you're consistently profitable, you should incorporate. If by any definition of losing money, including depreciation and things, that you're losing money, when you're unincorporated, you can just take it off your income.
Right.
As a straight deduction. Oh, plus I lost $1,000 on my business. Oh, okay, fine. And you just take it off your income.
Sure.
So until we got profitable, we waited, and then we incorporated the company, and that was in 1989. So
nice.
That's a long time. That's 25 years.
Wow.
And at first people just paid us to write code for them or to fix up code that someone else had written that was no good. And these days we also do an awful lot of mentoring, like helping people to be better developers. Mm-hmm. And I do even occasionally a little bit of management consulting, or come in and maybe fix up process or tell the higher ups what they're doing wrong.
That's funny. So at what point did you feel like you had figured out, the programming problem? I mean, because, learning to program is one thing, but sort of thinking in that developer mindset is sort of another. And learning all the constructs of a language and learning how pointers work is one thing, but how to create software that is going to, last is a whole nother problem. Where did that come from?
That's a good question. I think one of the things about going and doing the PhD was you have to learn how to be the expert. Mm-hmm. Because you literally cannot graduate until you prove I know more about this than anybody else.
Right.
And it doesn't really matter what this is. In my case, it was I wrote an awful lot of C++ code to simulate the way your blood reacts when it meets a foreign surface. There's a huge cascade of reactions that happen.
Interesting.
And actually found some stuff that's came close to settling some arguments that different experimenters had been having. But the change in me that, you have to shrug off your imposter syndrome. You have to accept the fact that on this particular tiny point, you totally know what you're talking about. Then that leaves you changed, and you're prepared to believe that you totally know what you're talking about on a variety of other points over the decades.
Is there a way you can do that without getting a PhD?
Yeah, sure. It's just a trial by fire.
Yeah.
I think it takes some people longer to realize it. Mm-hmm. Because it's a little like the ruby slippers, right? Like you could have always gone home and you could have always stood up and said, you know what? I'm actually right on this one. Mm-hmm. But until someone tells you that you have to, maybe it doesn't occur to you to do it.
Yeah. That lingering doubt in the back of your mind just, continues to nag at you, and every bad thing people have said about your work, even if you didn't agree with it at the time, sometimes, maybe they are right. So I could certainly see that, especially, having to go for the PhD as sort of the trial by fire to go through that. Did you have mentors through that process?
I had my supervisor who was great. And I had, my family, my parents are both academics. So my dad had a PhD in physics and my mom in faculty in consumer studies, family and consumer studies. That's what it's called. So they kind of knew the process and would help me through that. And I think also the fact that all the time I was a grad student, I was still working in the business side by side with my husband. So clients were saying, "Oh, thank you. This is amazing. This changes everything." Because we were still, by this time, in the late 80s and the early 90s, where computers were still continuing to change everything all the time and changing people's working lives, constantly, unrecognizably.
Yeah.
If you went back to an office of 1985, you wouldn't know what to do with yourself. Like in and out trays for mail and that kind of thing. And so the amount of validation that you keep getting from people who are like, "Oh, you just saved me an hour a day," or those sorts of comments, that also helps you to feel, yeah, I have a lot to offer, to the world, and you sort of strut around a little more in the rest of your life as well.
Well, like you said, you've been doing this, you've been running a consulting company for 25 years. Have you ever considered doing something else?
Sure. Everybody has moments where they consider something else. We had some long, lean years where we had more staff than we do now, and payroll just kept coming around, and
seems to come around every month, whether you like it or not.
Yeah, a friend of mine told me that. He said payroll is a Mack truck that comes around the corner every 2 weeks, and you jump out of the way, but 2 weeks later, it just comes back at you.
Yeah.
And so when we had 11 people, and I spent all my time trying to find work for these people, trying to find money if people were slow. I spent almost no time doing what I was really good at, and all my time trying to manage everything. And so during some of those years, I thought I should get just a job, and not have to worry about any of this. And I was teaching one course at the university, which I absolutely adored doing because it keeps you in touch with young people and with all that energy. And I would think, I have a PhD. I bet these guys would take me.
It's nice, consistent, steady work.
Exactly. It's not that hard. You always think jobs aren't hard if you're not doing them. And then I would get a little burst of energy and say, no, I'd actually be a really horrible employee. I do very poorly at being told what to do. I do remarkably poorly at showing up on time every day, for a job. I've had some things with clients where they're like, "We need you to come in every day for 3 weeks or 6 weeks or whatever and work side by side, shoulder to shoulder, la, la, la." And I find that incredibly hard.
Yeah.
Because the way I live my life, some days I bounce out of bed at 7:00 and straight to a keyboard and start working and look up after a couple hours and go, I should shower and eat. Yeah. I should totally do that. And then other days, it's 11 and I haven't done anything yet. And I'm used to being able to live in that rhythm.
Yeah.
And so as an employee, I would be terrible.
Well, I think that's an interesting observation because developers, I think, even inside companies, sometimes are given extra slack because the nature of development sometimes is that you can't hammer your head into the wall to solve it, right? Sometimes you have to follow the rhythm of the problem.
That was a great piece of advice that I got from my PhD supervisor. He'd say, if nothing is working, go and weed the vegetable garden.
Right.
Just do something physical, get outside, especially if it's a nice day. Just take half an hour. You'll feel better because you accomplished something. And a lot of the times the solution will jump into your head while you're doing that work. Yeah. And he was right. That happened a lot.
I've solved more problems while playing guitar or playing pool than I probably have sitting at a keyboard. But, but sometimes you think you can think it through and sometimes you just need to let it go.
Right. And so because we work together, sometimes my husband and I'll get up and go for a walk.
Yeah.
And just solve that problem in the back of your head. You don't even know it when you come back to your desk. Oh, of course. And then you're good.
And of course, I know you as, someone that's been in the C++ space forever, as you even alluded to earlier. Was there ever a point where you thought, I'm interested in something different? Is it that the language is just the tool to do interesting work, or is it a love affair with the language that you have?
A long time ago, Stan Littman wrote an article called "Still in Love with C++," and I think that describes me too. I am, and I use other languages.
Sure.
God help me, I used to teach Java. But I love C++ in a way that other languages are just tools.
Sure.
So I used to do some Java stuff. I did a ton of .NET stuff. And some technologies come and go. So like .NET remoting is going to be the greatest thing ever, or BizTalk is how we're going to solve all the world's problems. And things come and go. And I, just like everybody else, I jump on the new shiny exciting thing. And the sort of rock steadiness of C++ is that when the shiny thing loses some of its shine, the C++ is still there.
Still chugging away.
And and then when C++ 11 came along and really fixed a bunch of things that were problematic about the language, changed it. The joke is we made it simpler by adding more stuff, but it's only funny because it's true. Like, we did add stuff to C++, and that did make it simpler. And so that was maybe 2.5 years ago. I suddenly personally only had C++ work. So the rest of the company still had some of our .NET projects and some of our older clients, but the only work that was coming into me was C++, which has been wonderful. It's been fantastic for me.
Oh, when I interviewed Scott Myers, he talked a bit about this huge gap between when 11 came out and the last standards round, which I don't remember off the top of my head what that was called. Was 11 that revolutionary that, people have been dragging their feet for years, that it just had to happen?
Oh, yes, absolutely. So depends how you count. The previous standard was either 98 or 03.
Right.
But 03 wasn't really a whole new standard. It was just like a sort of bug fixes to 98. So, it had been a decade. And for someone in the Microsoft world like me, it had been a decade in which Microsoft had done almost nothing.
Sure.
The MFC DLLs still had the same timestamp, for 10 years. The tools, the .NET people would get some fun, cool capability, and it wouldn't be there for C++.
Right.
Whether it was a WPF designer or refactoring or really almost anything. There'd be this, go to a launch, it would say, here's what's new and exciting in Visual Studio, and this works in all the languages. And I'd be the one in the back of the room putting my hand up saying, all? Really? All? And they'd go, oh, damn, Kate's here. No, both. It doesn't work in C++. Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah, so that we call that the lost decade.
Yeah.
Where really nothing happened, and in other people in other tool chains or on other operating systems, maybe their compiler vendors just wandered away, and didn't sell a compiler anymore. And C++ 11 was huge. Absolutely astonishing.
So was it the fact that no one was innovating in that space either? I mean, it wasn't the new compiler and some of the other guys weren't, innovating either.
There was innovation.
There was no competition.
There was innovation, but it wasn't standard, and so you couldn't count on it.
Sure.
So there was Boost, for example. A lot of what's in C++ 11 is stuff that was proven in Boost. And either the Boost as a library, so some of that stuff went into the standard library, and some of it was, this capability would be far less awkward if we changed the language and made it a keyword or new piece of punctuation. But the proof was there in that library. But Boost wasn't standard, and at any moment you might, get a new boss or change jobs and be told, oh, we can't use third-party libraries here.
Right.
And so you couldn't stake your career on it. Once something comes into the standard, relatively, you can count on it and be safe.
As long as everyone's, using the latest compilers.
Well, sure. Compiler compliance is a fun game to play. And now that the language has decided to update itself far more often, you get to play it for longer. So it's a moving target.
Yeah.
I don't really care whether or not you did all of C++ 11. How are you doing on C++ 14? And what about C++ 17, which is starting to come together now? Have you got any of that implemented? And so there was a tweet that came out where one of the developers of one of the smaller compilers was sitting in the committee room while they were voting on some feature. And, in order to add something to the language or the library, you have to explain how it would work and how to implement it. And he was implementing it, sitting on his laptop, implementing it in his compiler. And when they had the vote and it passed, he hits enter and commits it. So it's like, okay, we're feature up to date. The committee added this feature and I've implemented it, so I'm caught right up. No. And obviously Microsoft can't do that.
No. But do you think they're finally committed to staying with the standards?
Yes, absolutely. They are. They're not being mechanical about it. So, for example, they didn't take, we have to do all of 11 and then we'll start doing 14. They keep a giant backlog pile, and they did some of the more higher pri pieces of 14 before they did some of the lower pri pieces of 11. Mm-hmm. But every single release in CTP that comes out, they're accommodating more and more. And some of the things in 17 have been actually proposed by Microsoft people.
Nice.
So they're already in the Microsoft products as extensions. And all that's going to happen if they get into the standard is a spelling change.
Wow. That's great.
Yeah.
So to wrap up the podcast, I'd like to ask a question, and that is, at any point in your career, from when you started college earlier or wherever you were in that, do you think you would have made any decision differently?
It's funny. People expect that I might regret the grad work since I didn't go and work in chemical engineering and I didn't go and do blood research into why blood clots, but I don't regret that for a minute because of how it strengthened me.
Sure.
I don't regret growing the company as much as I did and chasing the kind of work that I did, but I waited a long time to lay people off when there was no money coming in, and I borrowed a lot of money personally, hundreds of thousands of dollars. And if you wait a real long time to lay people off and then lay them off anyway, they do not thank you for waiting that long and taking on that debt. And I would have been more ruthless. I think if I had a business mentor who would have said to me, maybe when it hit 50,000, you got to stop.
Yeah.
I'd have a bigger retirement package now. I really like where I am now, how the company works and the kind of clients we have and the kind of work we do. And maybe I would have gotten here quicker if I hadn't been chasing the kind of volume work that I needed to get, juniors fully billed.
Yeah.
And I did that, I think, for too long. That's really my only regret. The rest of it, I'm all good with.
Well, I love the story you told. I really like the idea of where you came from, and I really appreciate you being on the podcast. Been really enlightening. Oh, there was
fun.
There was one more question. I knew I was going to forget this. So you started pretty early. We recently talked to Kathleen Dollard, and I asked her the same question because I think it's important for people that are listening to the podcast. Did you find that as a woman getting into computing, especially in the 70s and 80s, that you were, that was an impact on you? Was it a boys' club? In some ways, it's still a boys' club, but in my mind, when I started back in 85 or 86, there were never women developers. And I wonder what your experience was there.
So I'm lucky in that I was always very, very smart. And if you're the smartest person in the room, you can get away with being non-standard in some other way, like being a woman or being blind or something else that makes you different,
right? Because
people will tolerate it. And I think it's kind of a shame that it's difficult for women to just be meh. Like you can probably name 5 or 10 great woman developers that I sure can. And you can probably name 5 or 10 great men that but you can probably name 100 men who are just kind of meh. They're okay. They put their time in 9 to 5. But it's really tough for a lot of women to get into that zone. They're kind of not allowed in that zone. They have to be great.
Yeah.
So, that's kind of a sad thing. There were people, absolutely, there still are to this day, people, for example, who didn't want to talk to me. If I sent over my junior, who was 10 years younger than me with way less experience, the client was happy. If I went over, they were not happy. I figure, those are all former clients.
Exactly.
So, the nice thing about being very good at what you choose to do is that, life is too short to work with people who don't appreciate you.
Absolutely.
And that's an option for me. I would love it to be an option or not have to be an option for kind of middle of the road kind of people. And I think that's a scary thing, that I can only name great women. I can't actually name ordinary women.
Right.
And I certainly had people who thought I was the secretary, who still to this day, when I phone, they ask to talk to the owner,
Yeah, I do.
But I am grateful that I'm not 20-something now, because some of what's happening to younger women who are public figures right now is horrifying.
It is.
The death threats and rape threats and just disgusting the way they're speaking. The clearly some group of men feel threatened. Yeah. And are pushing back. And I don't know that I would necessarily had the emotional strength to push through that. It's one thing to be ignored or patted on the head or asked what your husband does when you show up at a conference, that kind of thing. That is mildly irritating. It's on a whole nother plane with the sorts of things where you need to phone the police.
Exactly. Well, I think that's really good insight. I appreciate having you on the show. And you enjoy the cold weather that's coming, because I'm sure you have your snow boots ready.
Absolutely. I am looking forward to some nice crisp fall nights. Absolutely.
Well, thanks again.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Hello World podcast. Remember,